LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, why Chris Dixon believes the blockchain is still critical to our future. Have you heard the internet's origin story? It begins with a nuclear attack. Okay, not an actual attack, the threat of one. In the late 60s, as the Cold War festered, the US military wanted to build a communication system that could survive nuclear war. And the best way to do that, they realized, was to create a decentralized network. They linked up a bunch of computers over telephone lines and then had those computers pass little bits of information back and forth like a game of hot potato. That's actually what they called it, hot potato routing. The beauty of this system was that if one computer went down because, the others would just pick up the slack. The scientists and military brass who worked on this project thought they were protecting their country from the Soviets. What they didn't realize was that in the process, they had invented the internet. Hot potato routing, which today we call packet switching, and the other protocols they established were like the genetic code of the modern internet. And here's the thing about that genetic code. No one owns it. Or better put, we all own it. That was the vision of the early internet, Web 1.0 as it's called. Open, democratic. The problem was that just because everyone owned the internet didn't mean everyone could use it. In the early days, launching a website was cumbersome and expensive. I know firsthand. I launched my first website, nerve.com, in 1997. It was about as sophisticated as an online pamphlet, and it cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in those early years to build and maintain. And as some of you may remember, it was slow. Then in the 2000s, a new class of privately owned corporate networks emerged, sites like Facebook and Twitter. They made an irresistible offer. Communicate with everyone through a sophisticated interface free of charge. The catch? Your identity, your connections, and the ad revenue generated by the content you create does not, in the end, belong to you. Does it matter, you might ask?
I think it's actually quite important that people own those kinds of digital properties in the future, as people spend 7 hours a day on the internet. This idea that the internet is there's the real world in the internet. I don't think that's a very viable distinction anymore. It's a very important thing. It drives politics, it drives culture, it drives business.
Yeah.
Who owns the different aspects of it is a very important issue for the next few decades, right?
That's Chris Dixon. And not only does he think it's imperative that we own our online identities, he thinks the ideal technology for doing so already exists.
The new thing a blockchain lets you do is it lets you have computers that can make commitments and can grant ownership.
That's right, the blockchain. The technology that powers Bitcoin, which Warren Buffett called rat poison squared. The technology behind NFTs. Remember those? Yeah, me neither. Chris, it should be said, has a vested interest in promoting blockchains. As the founder of A16Z Crypto, an offshoot of the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, he and his team have invested $7 billion in blockchain companies. To borrow another one of Buffett's phrases, he's got skin in the game, lots of skin. But there's a less cynical way to view Chris's blockchain evangelism. And it's this view that I came to hold after reading Chris's new book, Read, Write, Own, and speaking with him on stage at an event in New York City last week. Chris says great technologies take time. We know this. Computer scientists have been working on neural networks for 80 years, and they finally became useful with the launch of ChatGPT in November 2022. We've heard that virtual reality was around the corner for decades. And if you believe the rumors, it might be about to come to fruition this decade. Chris believes that both AI and the metaverse increase the need for the value that blockchains deliver, a secure, distributed computation platform that tracks ownership and makes long-term commitments. As AIs generate more and more information online, the ability to track ownership of ideas and art and speech in a way that is secure and reliable is likely to become more important. Is blockchain technology the best way to do this? I'm not sure. But I do know this. More and more of our political conversations, our cultural experiences, and our social interactions are happening online. And this trend is likely to continue. Some of them will be happening in 3 dimensions in the metaverse. Do we want our online identities, preferences, and our relationships, our social graph, to be owned by private companies? Or do we want the public square to be public and our digital identities to be ours? Chris Dixon says we're going to have to choose, and he sees a promising path forward.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you to our friends at BetaWorks for hosting. Thank you, Chris, for being here.
Thank you.
Folks, so what follows is this is a live podcast taping for the Next Big Idea podcast. So Chris, know that this will be edited. And so if you want to stop and rephrase a sentence, you're welcome to do so.
Good, thank you.
Chris Dixon, welcome to the Next Big Idea.
Thank you for having me. Should I hold this like this, or can you hear me like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, first of all, Chris, congratulations on the publication of Read, Write, Own, which came out yesterday. Yeah. You picked a hell of a time to publish this book, right? Because it reads almost like a manifesto about the potential of blockchain technology to liberate us as digital citizens. 2 years ago, that would have been more of a consensus view. Yeah. This morning, I saw someone describe Web3 as, quote, an enormous grift that is pouring lighter fluid on our already smoldering planet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got some headwinds that you're going into as you go out on your book tour. But I think it's best to start with your story.
Yeah.
I mean, you've witnessed various stages of the evolution of the web, and I think that's impacted your perspective and your view of what the internet could be in the future. Do you want to share a little bit about your journey?
And maybe I won't bore you with all my personal details, but I do think it relates to the book and why I'm doing this and why I'm sort of care about these topics. So I was in college in New York in the 90s and was in actually a philosophy program and thought my parents were academics and thought I would be an academic. And then I started reading like Wired magazine, and I'd meet people working in the internet, and this is like sort of the late .com bubble in the late 90s. And for me, it was a real epiphany. I mean, one, I didn't know you could sort of, this world existed where you could go and build products and be an entrepreneur. And I just, I'd come from Ohio. My parents were English professors. And it was just like, wow, that seems like kind of a cool thing you can do. I thought, because I kind of had this cartoon version of business that it was like all, I don't know, people in suits selling stuff or something. And like you could actually like invent stuff. And it sounded sort of adventurous and swashbuckling and cool or something. And so that was part of it, but a lot of it was the internet was like, whoa, this, it kind of, in some ways it was inevitable that we'd link all the computers in the world together, right? I mean, you sort of think about, okay, you've got all these computers, why wouldn't you connect them, right? But the fact that we connected them in a decentralized way, right, that there was no company in the middle, was this a really remarkable thing. I mean, I sort of see myself as almost an accidental technologist in a sense that I really fell in love with this idea. I think a lot of people in that era were really motivated by that this was a really, really powerful new thing that anybody in the world could put up a website, but it was your little plot of land and you owned that, right? And I like, maybe I'm naive, but I bought into it. Like I really thought it was powerful. And so that was the 90s web. And I got it sort of early 2000s, then the crash happened. And It was ugly. People really, it sounds absurd now, but people really, really thought it was, they didn't think it was over, but it was the idea that it would be a business was the kind of thing people were very skeptical of. It'll be this thing you use, you'll buy your plane tickets, you'll email, but all of these visions of the 90s that it's going to revolutionize the planet and revolutionize business, that was all overhyped. And then that era, people called it the read-write era. And the idea was, let's pull ourselves out of these smoldering ruins and let's do it by embracing what is special about this medium. And what's special about this medium was that it was a two-way medium, that you could not only democratize the consumption of information, you could democratize the publishing of information, right? And that began as blogging.
Yeah.
And then you had sort of, like you often have in technology movements, you had the purists of like the blogger types. And then you had the pragmatists who were like the Zuckerberg types, right? Who sort of took the Bill Gates who kind of saw what the purists were doing and said, no, I'm going to productize this. And, took what, the bloggers were the indie bands in Brooklyn. And then, Mark Zuckerberg was the the metal band in Milwaukee playing the stadium or something, right? Like he took this kind of movement and made it, I probably butchered that music reference. I'm not a music person, so that was, I'm going on and on.
And then we had this acceleration of corporate networks, right? We had we had this something happened that we didn't see coming, right? With corporate networks.
The way I view it is there was sort of this Faustian bargain in the 2000s, which is on the one hand, we did get this vision, did get realized, which is the web became truly democratic. Anyone could publish, right? But I do think there was sort of this trade that we made, which is in order to get that result, we did that by handing power over to what turned out to be a very small set of big companies, right? I mean, we didn't know that back then, and specifically, there was a moment in the mid to late 2000s, I believe, where it was still a question as to whether social networking, which really is the most important application in terms of just time spent online, money spent online. There was a moment, probably up until 2007 or 8 or so, where that could have been an open protocol, right? And you could imagine there's an alternative history. On Earth 2, they are using, in 2024, we're using TikTok and everything else, but they're all just different payloads being fed through an RSS protocol. And on Earth 2, I think I would argue, in the book I argue, you have a very different result in terms of particularly the economic result, which is because of the fact that you had these 5 companies, so networks have what are called take rates, and the take rate is the percentage of the revenue that's sort of flowing through the network that's taken by the toll keeper, by the centralized entity. And the social networks today, there's the top 5 social networks, about $150 billion in revenue last year, and they have 100% take rates, which means you have sort of these, the way I think of it is like you have these roads, like imagine the internet like the highway system, and all of this money flowing around in commerce, but then these incredibly high toll keepers. And I worry we are headed to a world where it's getting so consolidated that it's going to become like 70s broadcast TV or something, where you really have 3 channels. And then with AI, AI tends to favor companies that are well capitalized and have lots of data, and that will play. This will just continue to consolidate. And so the question we have, I think, before us is that a good thing or not? Maybe there's policy solutions for it, and I think that's a reasonable conversation to have. I also would argue there are technology solutions, and sort of the core argument to my book is that blockchains, which, as you pointed out, have been so maligned and associated with, grift and casino culture and fraud and everything else, I argue that essentially they are tools, and they can be used for bad, as we've seen, but they can also be used for good. And the point of the book is to make that case.
Yeah. So to paraphrase, this Faustian bargain was, on the one hand, we're going to get all these free ability to publish, free ability to communicate with our friends, but then we wake up and realize we're in Disneyland. Everything is owned by this corporation. So you built up a Twitter audience. You can't take your handle, can't take your relationships and move them somewhere else. As you pointed out, the open protocols we had in the early internet with email and HTML, it was a little bit like a collaboration. I love this metaphor you have of a collaboration that you see in a city between public space and private space, right? That we have shared public roads and parks and services, and cities are incredibly dynamic because you have this combination of this partnership. Whereas what we have emerging in a Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or so on looks a lot more like a Disneyland. And I think the imminent question in front of us is, what do we want to have in the next 10, 20, 30 years as the metaverse is born, as these new spaces are born. And I think your thesis is blockchain technology is necessary in order to create a more egalitarian future. Is that accurate?
Well, I think it's, you say necessary, like I think there are, for example, maybe you could achieve some of these things through regulation and policy. I don't know. I haven't seen good proposals for that. But for example, people have ideas around data portability where you can export your names from one social network to another. So I don't want to dismiss all the other possibilities.
Yeah.
And look, new things could come along. Maybe I can finish the kind of motivation side. So
sure.
I've been involved. So I got interested in the sort of blockchains. I sort of put my toe in the water about 10 years ago. And then got more and more interested in it, and was obviously very disappointed a few years ago to see what happened, with FTX and all these other kind of fiascos, because this was just obviously not why I was doing this. And then for me, that was a kind of a crossroads moment of like, do you kind of give up and like maybe this has just been kind of burned and like as you've said, this is an interesting time.
And did you consider giving up?
It was very frustrating. I mean, I was very frustrated. I was very frustrated with it, for sure. Look, I thought of it two ways. On one hand, I kind of went back and forth. I'm like feeling, depressed. And then the other side of me said, well, maybe this is an incredible opportunity because it's not very often in technology. I've never seen a situation in technology where the gap between what I believe is the truth of the technology or the potential of the technology and the perception is so wide, right? So, there's two ways to approach it. One is you get kind of depressed about it. And the other, I said, I tried to look on the bright side. I was like, has there ever been an opportunity, like in my career, will I ever have a chance to try to close that gap and specifically to write a book? So that's what motivated me. I was like, let me write a book that explains my view and why I'm not sort of, hopefully not completely crazy, and tries to make the case as to why this technology is actually, that appears in many ways bad, actually can be quite good.
Now, to put a finer point on what that moment was like for you when FTX collapsed and we had what I guess some people might characterize as the beginning of a kind of blockchain winter. So you had, as I think many people know, you were the founder of the A16Z crypto fund, which has deployed $7 billion in investments in crypto and Web3 technologies. So it's fair to say you have a dog in this hunt. You were a hero in early 2022. You ranked #1 on Forbes' Midas list of top venture capitalists in the world. And then what happened? November 2022 was a doozy, right? FTX goes bankrupt, tainting the industry. And then ChatGPT launches at the end of November and becomes the fastest growing application in history, right? And I think a lot of people had this view that like, I've been hearing about blockchain, it sounds cool, but these guys have had 10 years plus to actually create an application or something that is really useful at a large scale, and it hasn't happened. Meanwhile, this new AI product is extraordinary. Yeah. And I think there was a sense that it was sort of eclipsed. How would you characterize that moment and kind of what that has done to the industry?
Yeah, so I guess I don't think of it as I don't think so. I remember going back to the last era, right? There was sort of these three buzzwords: mobile, social, cloud, and that was kind of the jargony words in 2008 or 9. And what ended up happening is they were all real, right? Mobile and social and the cloud computing were all real. And in fact, they reinforced each other. So for example, mobile is what allowed 5 billion people to have smartphones. Social is the kind of killer app that makes people want to have them. And cloud is the infrastructure that supports them. I think if anything, and we can talk more about it later, I think if anything, AI is going to help blockchains because I think in many ways they complement each other. So I didn't think of it that way. And I think this stuff is really cool. And I think what ChatGPT's done is amazing. And I know there's a bunch of probably entrepreneurs here working on it. I think it's generally a good thing. And then let me just also say, we were not investors in FTX, just to be clear. But most of the things that did have, in fact, all of the kind of scandals we were not involved with directly, but it tainted the industry for sure. So that was the part I was more upset about. It's just that I see it as a technology that's very positive, and it was tainted by those incidents. And getting that message through, just to be clear. So
It reminds me very much of March 2000, which you and I remember, which is when we had the original .com implosion. And what I remember about it is that everybody was saying that there was, for people who were inside the industry, which is a small number of people, it was devastating. Like I'd say 90% of my friends in New York who were building internet-related companies lost their jobs within 6 to 12 months. But for everyone who wasn't in the industry, which is most people, they were actually elated, right? Because there had been this sense that like, well, there are all these, there are people reinventing the world through this internet thing, and I missed out. There was a sense of FOMO, and people are getting rich, and I'm sitting on my couch not getting rich. And then the whole thing collapses. Pets.com, why would anyone ever buy pet food over the internet? That was so stupid. The whole thing was a fraud. Right. That was how people responded in 2000, 2001 with a sense of relief and kind of delight. I remember friends at Condé Nast who were like, we were totally right not to invest in the internet. That whole thing was a total distraction. Obviously, fast forward a couple decades and like some people do actually buy pet food online. And Chewy, we were talking earlier, how much is Chewy worth?
Yeah, it was a big successful company. I don't know the details, but yeah.
But I think it feels to me like even though I'm still in the process of trying to assess whether or not blockchain will be critical to our future, it does seem to me like there's something similar happening in the last 18 to 24 months with the response to the blockchain, headwinds recently, right? Which is a sense that like, instead of being angry at myself for not buying Bitcoin or feeling like I missed out, it's kind of exciting. It's a much better answer to say the whole thing was a scam.
I think it's a common pattern in markets and specifically technology markets to have periods of over-enthusiasm and then over-pessimism essentially. And I guess my view is that you can't predict the future, but it can help if you kind of break, like the way I think about trying to predict the future. Like let me give you an example, social media. 2006, it was very easy to laugh at Twitter as nerds talking about their burrito they had or something, and for lunch, right? I mean, and that was literally, that for a long time, that was the narrative. And of course, it ended up determining elections and culture and business and being vastly important. How would you have figured that out in 2007? I think the only way you would have is if you really looked and peered into the essence of the technology. You said, what is this really, right? Like, is this really, like, is there anything in the nature of Twitter that is specific to lunch and nerds talking about lunch? No, it's a micro-messaging protocol. It's a protocol that lets anyone follow anyone and send information. I mean, that's what it really was, right? And so why wouldn't a protocol that lets anyone follow anyone and send them small pieces of information be as applicable to business, culture, politics, et cetera, as it is to burritos, right? My view is a lot of technologies arrive kind of disguised as something else. They arrive with their sort of accidental trappings. So crypto arrived with Bitcoin, and it had this right-wing libertarian kind of overtone to it, right? Let's take down the government. Let's replace them with money. And so I think that has really shaped a lot of the discussion. My argument is you need to look at what is it really in the same way you'd look at Twitter. Like, what is this really, this thing? Like, what does a blockchain really do? And that will help you kind of understand how you can divorce the accidental trappings and all of the laser eyes and people you don't like and all of this have fun staying poor and all this nonsense these people do that destroys the brand. Yeah. And like what I'm hoping to do with the book and just generally talking about it and trying to get people involved is to separate those two. Like, let's look at the technology. That's what the book is. Like, look at the technology for what it is. And like, blockchains are a new type of computer that have new properties that specifically are good at creating networks that have characteristics that basically let you create very powerful new internet services that also have the societal benefits of the early internet.
Now, can we start at the beginning with just explaining exactly what the blockchain is and how it works? Just the basics of distributed ledgers, proof of work. How do these systems work?
I see it as a computer, like a blockchain like Ethereum. Ethereum is a computer. You can write code for it. It's got a programming language called Solidity. But it's not a physical computer. It's not a computer you can put in your pocket. It doesn't sit somewhere. So a computer is defined as anything that has the functional properties that you can store information and then manipulate that information through code. Okay, that's what a computer is. And it turns out computers are substrate neutral, meaning you can build them using silicon. People have built them with pool balls and water droplets. And you can also build them with a network of computers, which is what a blockchain is. So with a blockchain, you have a set of computers which all kind of come together and together form a virtual computer. And that's what Bitcoin is. That's what Ethereum is. And there's a system where essentially, so in all computers, include not just blockchains, you have the current state of the computer, and then you have what's called a state transition, which is it then moves to a new state, right? So on your iPhone, it's happening, billions and billions of times a second, that it's sort of going from one state, the pixels are moving and all these other things are happening, right? On a blockchain, the way it works is that all of these computers that form the network, every so often come together and vote on the state of the new system. One of the kind of core ideas is anyone can join the network. Any computer can join the network. It's got to be open. Now, the problem when you make it open is what if you have spammers and other kinds of people who kind of join the network and send a lot of garbage and make bad votes and things. And so that's what one of the innovations of Bitcoin was, to have this thing called proof of work, which is essentially an entry fee you have to pay to vote on the state of the system. And it was a way to kind of avoid spam. Think of how post it, you have to pay postage when you send letters. And if you didn't have to pay postage, you'd send someone would send you 1 million letters and you'd get junk mail. In the same way, you have sort of an entry fee, right?
And the proof of work is difficult enough and expensive enough that it makes it prohibitively expensive for a third party to try to change the ledger and steal money effectively.
Yeah,
so to this date, as much sort of skepticism as there is out there about the blockchain, I think it's fair to say that Bitcoin has never been hacked.
Bitcoin's never been hacked.
Which is impressive
hacked,
given how many people have attempted to do it. So it's a very secure system, but the cost of the proof of work is bad for the environment, massive energy consumption.
That's right. And no, none of the major blockchains have ever been hacked, like Bitcoin and Ethereum. And if you did hack them, you'd get tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. So people have certainly tried. It's a very secure system. But as you mentioned, with Bitcoin, you pay a price, which is this energy use that I'm sure people have heard about. There's another system called proof of stake, which is what Ethereum uses and all the modern blockchains use, which don't use that kind of amount of energy. They use, instead of forcing you to do computations, they force you to basically put a little bit of money in escrow, which you then lose if you act dishonestly. And they are, I have a chart in the book, but they are, there is additional overhead as opposed to a traditional server, but it's much, much closer to a normal server. So it obviates the energy argument, if you want to.
And I'm not sure everyone recognizes that, right? Because I think there's a broad perception that blockchains are burning the planet. But I guess there's a view that there is a solution.
Pretty much unique to Bitcoin at this point. There are other niche blockchains, but essentially, and the Bitcoin people will never change that because it's almost like a religious belief for them to keep proof of work. People in the space who here will know what I'm talking about. But the rest of the kind of the tech side of the blockchain world, which I put myself on as opposed to the Bitcoin side, has already moved on to a much more energy efficient system. So that's not that. And by the way, then just while we're on the topics of myths, the idea that you hide things on blockchains. There are people working on privacy blockchains where you can hide stuff, but actually on all the major blockchains is actually everything is public. They're open to anyone to join. The modern ones do not waste energy. But look, you could still, a very reasonable objection. I'm not saying this is all sunshine and rainbows. Like the very reasonable objection is, what's the point? Except for trading and speculation. That's the next kind of objection you could make, and that's a fair objection, and that's what and my argument is turns out there's a really powerful thing you can do with a blockchain, which is you can create internet services that have the advanced functionality that we've come to love about modern internet services. Social networks, games, financial services for creators and media companies and things like this that have all of the kind of advantages of what I call corporate networks, of the big centralized companies, but have what I describe as the societal benefits of the early internet. It's kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's like protocol networks were this beautiful thing, HTTP, the web, email, that had all these wonderful properties and made the internet open and democratic. Then you made this Faustian bargain where we got corporate networks that had these because we wanted the powerful features, but we traded it by giving away control. And then synthesis, blockchain networks, I believe, can give you the best of both worlds.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
So to people who say, okay, this sounds cool, I get it in concept, but why? We've been talking about it for 10 years and there's no really broadly adopted mass, super useful application today. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. Like the first neural network paper was 1943. I think it took 80 years to get to ChatGPT. I think from the outside, sometimes I think, people think smartphones. Go watch. There's a great documentary on General Magic. It was, I think, 93. They were trying to create the iPhone. Go watch. You Got Mail. What year was that? I don't know what year. Go watch like The Net or like Friends. Yeah. Friends is when years of I think Friends was like 97 to 2003 or something, right? And like the internet, there's one I actually looked it up. There's one episode where they talk about the internet. This is like 2003. This is supposedly after the internet's happened. Like it doesn't exist. It doesn't. The internet really started. I mean, in the way we think of it as this always on thing on your phone, that was like the iPhone 2007, App Store 2008. But if you look at the data on the iPhone sales, that's kind of 10 years ago. Yeah. Like so when you really had what we think of as the always on internet today, like it's pretty recent.
Yeah. Your point is that this stuff takes time.
It does.
And if you think of like research on neural nets started in the 50s, right?
Yeah.
It took
first paper was 1943.
Right, 60 years, right? Yeah. So timing is a bitch. I mean, predicting, as we know, it's difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future. And we remember we were talking earlier about how, in the late 90s, we were all saying like virtual reality is right around the corner. Video conferencing we thought was around the corner. It took another 20 years. How confident are you that the blockchain will prove to be a super useful technology? Is it just a matter of time, or is it something that we need to fight for in order to make the future of the internet better?
My view, I guess I'm kind of a infrastructure is destiny thing a little bit. Like Steve Jobs is obviously an incredible genius, but probably had he not done the iPhone in 2007, I'm guessing someone would have done a smartphone in the next couple of years.
It became possible.
Yeah, the semiconductors got to a point, the touch screens, like the modems, like all the kind of components, right? Yeah. And same thing, like, I think what Sam Altman and those folks and just all the different people working in AI have done is amazing. But probably, right, it was somewhat determined by the underlying infrastructure. And so then if you take it that view, then you ask yourself with blockchains and things, like, look, with blockchains until even now, but especially 2 years ago, it would cost on something like Ethereum $5 when you do a transaction, meaning an action. Okay. Yeah. And that was an infrastructure. That is an infrastructure limitation. And so what does that mean? If every time you click on something you have to pay $5, what classes of application are viable in that scenario? Well, speculation, like trading, right? I mean, there are not many things like social networking and gaming where you'll pay $5 to take an action, right? And so, when you look at it through that infrastructure lens, then you start to say, okay, how does that curve look, right? Yeah. And now, in the last 2 years, we've at least gotten it down 10x, and we'll probably be another 10x, I think, soon. I hope. Yeah. But you start to look at I've over time started to look at the world much more through the lens of what are the core infrastructure drivers and what are the trends and how do you see them going to try to get a better sense of timing? Right.
It could be right. Because the question, if you're an LP in A16Z crypto, the question is this AI in the 80s or is it AI in 2010 or AI in 2022, right? Yeah. I mean, the question of timing becomes highly relevant. Let's get into the question of what some of the most exciting applications are of the blockchain. Yeah. And I think as we get into that, we can also talk about some of the objections. Should we maybe start with NFTs? I think there are a lot of people who sort of think of NFTs as being kind of silly, right? But I think you make an argument in the book that there's actually something more going on.
Yeah, I think the way I describe it is generally with sort of tokens, there's a concept, I kind of go through it in the book, this concept of encapsulation. So encapsulation is a software concept where you take kind of a complex idea and you put it in a simple container. And so think of the original vision of the web. So, not the internet, but the World Wide Web. The original vision was, let's have this sea of information, this ocean of information, and anyone in the world can contribute to this ocean of information, right? How does that not become an incredibly overwhelming thing that just becomes this cacophonous, chaotic mess? the beautiful idea was the website, right? So the website was like, this is a container, and this is the unit in which anyone can go and join this sea of information. And then the second great idea, of course, was the hyperlink, and then this is a way to connect these two. So it made a really ambitious, kind of almost crazy idea manageable, right? And so in the next era, the post, right? So you sort of take all, like, again, now we're gonna let everyone speak to each other, and we're gonna let them all interact. And so we need a unit, a way to kind of contain that, right? So the key feature of a blockchain is that, and I didn't get into this really so far, but like the reason you do all of those complicated design things in a blockchain is you want to be able to have what I call a blockchain is a computer that can make commitments. So you do all this stuff so that you can have the computer where you can write code, and you know that the code you write will continue operating as designed. So you can, for example, create code that says the user owns this name in a social network. I am C. Dixon in the social network. A blockchain can commit to you, because it's a computer that can make commitments, it can commit to you that you really own that name, which means that even if you join one social network and use that name and then they do something you don't like, you own it, and so you can take it with you and move it to the other network. In the same way that you own your website. Like it's protocol networks also respect ownership, right? Like if I don't like what my web hosting provider is doing, I have cdixon.org, I can take my website and move it to another hosting provider, and that gives me economic and other kinds of leverage, and that's what a lot of what enabled the first era of the web, right? And so a token is a similar idea, which it encapsulates this kind of idea of ownership, and it can encapsulate an identity. Is one thing you could have. You could have your data, for example, like you could have all of my preference data or my music tastes, or that could be contained in a token. It's something that I own. It could be an object in a video game. It could be a unit of economic value. It could represent $1, like a stable coin. It could be like Bitcoin, or represents this other kind of currency. It's a completely abstract thing, like a website, right? And it's a container of ownership, and that's why it's read, write, own. It's the new thing a blockchain lets you do is it lets you have computers that can make commitments and can grant ownership, and they do it in the form of a token. And a token is an abstract concept, and it just so happens, in the same way that social media began with nerds talking about burritos, NFTs began with people with like PFP avatars and things like this. But don't confuse the accidental kind of use of the technology in the early phases with what it can do in all of its different instantiations.
And in asking the question, which some listeners may be thinking, like, does owning some unique digital thing matter? It seems to be there are 2 points you make in the book that to me are quite powerful. The first is that, as it happens, in 2018, the gaming industry sold $36 billion in virtual goods. Mm-hmm. And as you point out, a gamer is basically renting that virtual good, in the sense that they don't actually own it. They can't take it to any other platform. Humans love to signal status, right? We love having, watches and cars and things that demonstrate to people that we have social status. The fact that in 2018 we already had $36 billion virtual goods in circulation at this point, and we're moving into a world probably in some period of time, it's hard to predict how long, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of a metaverse environment. Yeah. The value of ownership of digital goods is going to be potentially enormously powerful. Would you?
So yeah, I think video games, so I don't actually play video games, but I think it's a very interesting industry, and maybe I'll try to explain why. I think of the video game industry as, it's like William Gibson, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Like, to me, that's video games, and that they are the future of media. And let me explain that. So the video game industry prior to the internet had the same model that all media had, which is you have a game and you charge $50 for it. Video game industry said, over time, they did a very radical thing, which is they said, let's give away the game, right? So Fortnite, League of Legends, the games are free. Let's give away the thing we used to charge $50 for, we'll now give away. And the reason they did that is that the internet, what they realized is that the internet is by nature a copying machine. The internet likes to spread information. People want to share information. They want to stream. They want to meme. And so, like in the book, I call it that basically in media you have this dilemma between what I call the attention monetization dilemma. You have this dilemma where on the one hand you want to have, you're fighting in this Darwinian struggle for attention, right? Every piece of content in media is fighting to be seen. On the other hand, you need to make money. And so the natural way to make money is to add scarcity, right? And so that's why you put it behind a paywall and things like this. So like the big question for anyone who's creating media on the internet is how do you balance those two things, right? And what the video game industry did that was very interesting, right, is they said, well, let's expand what our product is, right? Instead of like you could imagine an alternative world where they just said like, let's give away the first level. And some games do still do this. Like you get the first level for free and then you charge for this. You could split it in different ways. But the really advanced video games and where it's all going and all the forward-looking games do now is they just give away the whole game, all the levels, the whole thing. You can play all of Fortnite. You can play all of League of Legends. You can play all of these, Clash Royale. You can do all these things, play the full game and never spend $1, right? And they said, you know why? Because then we'll just like, it'll meme, it'll spread, it'll do all these things. And instead, let's add some new thing that didn't exist before, which is this virtual good layer, which is, you can buy the skin and the emote, the dance move when you shoot the guy or whatever. And why would you want that? It's because you are playing a social game and you're in a community and it becomes part of your identity. And for the same reason you'd want a Birkin bag or whatever people do in the real world, like you want this clothes or something. And so a Ferrari. Yeah. And so, because that's become your virtual life and you want to look good and you want a status signal in that community. And so the video game did that. This very interesting move. And then I have sort of the punchline in that chapter of the book is this chart, which is the music industry. And I didn't show the other industries, but all the other media industries are either down or flat over the life of the internet. And the video game industry went from the same size as the music industry, like roughly 20 billion to 180 billion. Okay. And it's and actually, I think I overlay it in the book, I do, with like each wave of technology. And every time there's a new wave of technology, the video game industry keeps going up. And everyone else is like flat or down, right? So what they've done is they said, okay, what is the nature of the internet? The internet's a copy machine. It's a Darwinian fight for attention. Let's lean into that. Let's let them stream. Let's let them share. That's why you see the video game content everywhere, right? It's like the kids it's native to social media. They're sharing it. And let's figure out something else to charge for. And to me, that's one of the interesting things with NFTs is it's basically offering that same promise, if used correctly, to other areas of media, and specifically in an era of generative AI, which I think will put further downward price pressure on, if you're an illustrator today and like you were making money by selling illustrations and now Midjourney can do it, for free, it's going to sort of force your hand. I think it was Lenin heightened the contradictions, right? Like that's going to kind of break a lot of these kind of delicate balances.
This to me is the most compelling and certainly the most interesting argument for the importance of blockchain in the future is this argument that we have. I think the broad perception has been that AI just sort of replaced the blockchain as the new driver of the future of the internet. But there's an argument that you make in the book that actually a consequence of AI, as we know, is mass proliferation of human-like media and content. And if there's anything that we want to be able to own, it's our own identity and our own words and our own videos and our identity online, right? So non-fungible tokens, NFTs, are perhaps their most powerful and important application could be to certify the provenance of all of our products online. Is that the view? What's the argument?
I think also I think the thing people are maybe underestimating is that you then have applications built around them. So like the NFT is not just sort of a thing that has like provenance. It also then hopefully you have a new wave of applications, which, for example, you can take this NFT represents my identity and my follow graph or my tastes, let's say. Like I like Goodreads. I like books. I read a lot of books and I like Goodreads, but like I want to own my book data and I want to be able to shop around to different book sites, right? Or different recommendation engines. And I want to take my data and I want to let them use it for that purpose, but I want to own it, right? And I think I don't think it's just like a weird nerd. Like I think it's actually quite important that like people own those kinds of digital properties in the future. As people spend 7 hours a day on the internet, like this idea that the internet is like there's the real world and the internet. I don't think that's a very viable distinction anymore. It's a very important thing. It drives politics, it drives culture, it drives business. Yeah. Like who owns the different aspects of it is a very important issue for the next few decades, right? And so, for example, who owns your health data? Who owns your financial data? Who owns your preference data? Who owns all of these? And who control? And so, by the way, NFT can control an NFT. Again, it's a container. So an NFT could, for example, contain your entire preference graph, all 10,000 things you like or whatever. Like that it is able to do that. It's not just a picture, right? It's a container of ownership. It's a unit of ownership. If I could add to the AI thing, like another interesting thing. So there's another chapter where I talk about what I call basically we need a new covenant between distribution and content. Let me describe that. So distribution on the internet basically happens through search engines and social networks, right? That's where you go and spend time. And then content is, quote unquote, is, the New York Times, media sites, websites. Over 30 years, there's evolved an implicit economic covenant between these distribution and content, right? And the covenant is, Google, you're allowed to index us, and you're allowed to use snippets in the search results. But the deal is you'll send us back some traffic. So in an AI world, though, like if you go to ChatGPT and you say, I want 10 restaurants, and it gives you 10 restaurants, well, are you going to click through anymore, right? And by the way, I'm not saying the AI systems are bad. I think if you can give users more utility, that's great. But it does break the covenant. And this will play out in court, there's the New York Times OpenAI thing. I think a better solution is, well, why don't we, instead of sort of fighting over the next decade through court cases, shouldn't we, the technology community, be thinking about what is the new covenant? Don't we want to have incentive systems for people to put up content on the internet? And so, my concern is we're going to end up with 5 websites that are big AI systems that have all the data. But to me, it seems like a much better outcome to think about new incentive systems that will incentivize creators. And what is a blockchain? One way to think of a blockchain is it's a way to design networks, economic networks that mediate the relationship between various parties on the internet, including content providers and distribution systems.
Right. So the notion is that if we're blogging, this can both a system like this can both track the provenance of individual blog posts that was created by an individual human and keep a record of that, but also potentially create a payment system. So I could be compensated if GPT-4 is hoovering in my content and using it. And
if your content ends up being
people,
useful, maybe there's a way. There's a new economic system you can design where the money cascades back according to the contribution to the system, as an example. And I would argue it's in everyone's interest to do that. We shouldn't fight it out in court. It's a better internet. I think it's better for the AI systems if you want to feed the input systems, right? Like why are we making this adversarial? I think we all want to see an internet where people are compensated for their contribution. We want to see an internet where people are, joining and adding content and is vibrant and lively, and not sort of this, what I see as a slightly dystopian sort of 5 big companies with offshore data centers feeding new training data, as an example.
If the claim is that this is the best way to establish ownership online, what about the slippage between the connection between me, Rufus, and my online identity? Right. I mean, my iPhone provides a solution for that. Apple ID projects 30,000 dots on my face and confirms who I am. Right. But there has been theft and fraud in blockchain systems and the problems with that connection between human and meat space and digital identity. I mean, would some people argue that you haven't solved the security problem if you haven't solved?
Yeah, I think maybe it's just a slightly easier one to start with would be something like deepfakes. So, deepfakes, of course, we basically have relied on video as the ground truth for, it's everyone's yelling at each other and debating stuff on social media, but then you see the video and you're like, okay, that's what actually happened. Turns out that's not going to work anymore because you're going to have AI that can do that. And then you also have the ability to have very sophisticated phishing and fake people. And so what that suggests is you need better systems for what you're describing, which is how do you identify it's a real person? How do you identify the provenance of a video? So think about the provenance of video. You want to say this video came from, the New York Times attests that this video is real. Okay, you want some kind of system like that, but you need to store that somewhere. That's also a natural use for blockchains. Blockchain is a community-owned database. And there are systems being built where you can have an attestation system where you can track the provenance of this video and know where it came from, and then decide whether you trust it and do similar things for people. And you're going to need these systems. I think in an AI world, we need these systems. And my argument is what we've seen in the history of the internet is if we don't step in with a kind of a public good, with a shared good, someone will step in with a private good. Facebook will do it. Apple's the leading contender to do that right now, right? They have your face, they have all of this stuff, and maybe they'll end up providing that. But the price of it, of course, is the lock into their ecosystem, the 30% tax, all of the other kinds of things.
Your point is that an Apple or a Google could provide this kind of proof of personhood and this and this security, but the cost is you're in Disneyland, and and over time, at some point, you're going to be charged.
I think all of these
extortionate
problems will get
fees for
solved
it.
because they have to get solved. Like the world is not going to allow us to be awash in deep fakes and phishing. Like something is going to solve it. To me, the interesting question is: does it get solved through something that I consider a blockchain sort of solution, a public good, or does it get solved through another private company solution? And in doing so, we simply make those companies more powerful, and then end up with this world of the 3 or 4 companies.
Yeah. And do you think this is an important inflection point with the promise of a potential growing metaverse when we think about how that is built, right, and how it's structured? Do you see in the next 5 years, 10 years, an important kind of time horizon for collectively concluding on, is this all going to be in Meta, or is it all going to be in Apple's spatial computing universe, or are we going to build something that's a hybrid of a public and private system?
There's different ways to think about it. There's sort of the VR and the device level. I think there's another way to think of it, which is just that 3D environments will become more common, more persistent, higher fidelity, and a bigger part of the internet experience. In the same way that, the internet moved from like kind of asynchronous to live, it'll move to more three-dimensional and spatial. And then a question, of course, that naturally comes up if you look at the world the way I do is, how is that world structured? Is it structured as a single company owning it, or 2 companies owning it, or is it structured like the World Wide Web, where it's like this open protocol and anyone can sort of can create a piece of it? And so my argument is that a lot of these things like metaverse, blockchain, AI systems, all of these things I'm talking about, they're all kind of making incremental progress, but at some point they'll happen faster than you think. And so what I part of my book and my pitch is sort of to the other people who share my views that we should have an open internet. I'm kind of trying to do a little bit of a rallying cry to them to say, guys, we got to get our act together and like define all the standards and have the systems ready so that when this world does come, there are viable open alternatives, because I would like to see the metaverse structured that way.
Right, and I guess some would say whether or not the blockchain is what is used as the technology to accomplish this, what's critical is that our identities are portable. Yeah. Right, and that, I mean, if you think back to the early open protocol, Web 1.0, we had open protocol, email, open protocol, HTML, websites, but we didn't build open protocol ownership of our social graph. Of our identities and our set of relationships, which could have been done hypothetically. Yeah. Right?
And by the way, that's one part of my argument in the book. By the way, like if we could do all of this with sort of what Web 1 protocols, like I would be all for it, and it'd be great. Like I would be all for it. It's been 30. So part of the argument I make, it's been 30 years, and there have been, and I enumerate many of them. There have been hundreds of credible attempts to create new protocol networks, and they're 2 at scale, and they're email and the web, and they were both created in the 1980s, right? And I argue that's because they were created before there was real competition. I think people really underestimate the level to which Web 2, these big companies, were built through subsidization. So, all of these companies have spent many billions of dollars. YouTube offered you free hosting when it started. RSS, you had to pay for hosting. Right? Yeah. And so there's all these reasons why protocol networks, as I call them, like RSS, have not succeeded. Right. And if they could, that'd be great. My view is sort of like, I think of those as like the folks who are sort of the blue sky RSS people as ideologically aligned. I just disagree on the method. I just think that hasn't worked, and we need to try something new and not be so emotionally allergic to blockchains just because some people, the laser eye people, were there and I'm going to get a lot of crap on Twitter from the laser eye people for this, but just because you don't like the people associated with it, like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater is kind of my argument, right? Now,
one way to address this problem of the challenges of switching between different platforms and owning our identities would be with regulation. What's your view? This is a critical time right now for regulation in this space. Yeah. This year, the EU's crypto assets regulation will take effect, creating a legal framework for issuing tokens and supervising transactions. The U.S. has been slower when it comes to regulation. Are we doing enough? Yeah. What's your take?
So I think, and this would be just not only, I think this is also going to play out with AI. These are the 2 kind of hot policy, probably, new technologies that are getting kind of a lot of policy attention, or crypto/blockchains and AI. I think my kind of core argument is but what's happening with crypto is it's all playing out in courts. And actually, I think AI is about to happen too, with like the New York Times OpenAI. And the problem with the courts is it just takes many, many years. You have uncertainty, and then you have like think about. Let's just talk about AI for a second. Like, so New York Times is suing OpenAI for copyright infringement, and then at some point you're going to have a judge who's trying to decide if is taking the New York Times content as training data, is it more like copying or is it more like you're inspired by it, right? And then they're going to sort of interpret some 100-year-old law and try to decide whether that law was intending that an AI system was inspired or copying. And like my argument, there's just no answer. I mean, I'm sure they'll come up with a ruling, but like, should the greatest country in the world that's led the internet and all these other things decide these important policy questions through some weird philosophical interpretation of a law 100 years ago? Same thing's happening with crypto. No, I think instead what we should do, I would argue, is look at the technology in its totality, look at the good things, look at the bad things. Like my book is trying to show the good things about blockchains. We've seen the bad things. In the ideal world, you'd then have a policy that says, how do we maximize the good and minimize the bad?
And so you think the right regulations are important to the success of this new technology?
For sure. Yeah.
And you're actively engaged, I think.
In fact, so I think there's also, and particularly like I talk about the casino aspects of blockchains. I think a lot of them we need regulation to rein that in. So the key idea to me is blockchain is ownership. In the same way, if you own a home, right? And I think we generally think in the real world, like the physical world, owning a home, ownership is a good thing. Like why owning a home we generally think is a good thing. It's good psychologically, it's nice to own a home. It's good financially. A lot of people's wealth comes through their home ownership. And it's good societally because it aligns incentives, right? Like the evidence shows that people that own homes take care of their homes. They're more likely to join community organizations. Like it aligns incentives, right? As a byproduct of home ownership, we have people that flip houses, we have REITs and speculation, right? And so I think generally the way we look at this in society on the physical world is ownership's an important thing. As a byproduct of ownership, you have some trading and speculation, and then we put rules around the trading and speculation so that it exists. There's some value to the trading around home things, but you got to circumscribe it, right? You got to make sure it's sort of reined in and not as a level playing field. And there's a bunch of sort of things you want to do. And I would argue it's the same thing here.
I'd asked earlier whether you saw the adoption of blockchain technology as inevitable or something that we have to fight for in order to create the kind of future of the internet that we'd like to have. 20 years from now, what do you think the probability is that blockchain technology will be an important piece of the foundation of how our digital world works? Would you say it's 50% probability, 80%, 90%? How probable do you think it is that that's the outcome?
I think if it weren't, okay, so I'm a little unusual in this, but I think that the tech world is underestimating the degree to which policy is going to be important for everything, not just blockchains, for AI. I think it's the new world. I think that Silicon Valley technology, internet lived in a kind of this regulation-free zone for a long time, and that's over, I believe. So to your question, if we still lived in that kind of digital playground, I think it would be basically inevitable because there's enough people working on it. All of the kind of core trends like the infrastructure, they're all getting better. People are building apps. At some point, those things. So I think in that world, right? But I don't think we live in that world. I think we live in a world where this perpetual adolescence is over. You gotta, this stuff matters. People realize it matters. Because a lot of the internet life, right, it evolved in this time when it was a little bit joked about or it was dismissed. And that gave it kind of this 30, 40-year run of being able to not have to kind of deal with these policy questions. And I think that world has changed now. So I think absent to that, I sort of think it's inevitable because I just look at the graph, the things I talked about, like the price to do a transaction, it's just dropping. Right. And there's all these sort of trend lines that are going in the right direction. And there's enough smart people, but I don't think we live in that world. I think we live in a world where it's path dependent on what happened. And specifically the bad stuff that happened, I think could be, and if that happens again, those kinds of things, it's existential. The way I think about it, I talk to my team about it is I'm quite sure a lot of this stuff will rebound out of this, but do we do it in the right way or the wrong way is what I think about a lot. Like, do we do it by building great products that make the world better, or do we do it through like another speculative bubble or something like this? Like,
so your book is a call to action, really, right? To rally people to.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, you could argue it's the worst time. You could also argue it's the best time, right? If you believe, as I do, that there's a lot of really excited builders who are building interesting things. What I'm partly doing is trying to, kind of influence them and sort of, and also people adjacent to them and around them. But I do think, like, I don't know, I'm just trying to outline, I guess, a positive vision. That I hope.
So greater than 50% probability that the blockchain is a critical part of our future if everybody fights for it and supports it.
I think the tech trends are inevitable. There's tens of thousands of smart people working on it, which is sort of, you have critical mass of smart people. I think a lot of it is about how we guide it from here and whether we guide it in the right direction and whether we start to really show positive use cases and applications and move away from the speculation and the other kinds of things that have been harmful.
Chris Dixon, thank you for your time today. What a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. This conversation with Chris raised as many questions as it answered for me. I'm still trying to figure out the role that blockchain technology will have in our future, but I understand better than before the potential solutions it offers. Will we see, in the decades to come, a competitor to Uber emerge, which distributes ownership to early drivers and customers with each ride in the form of tokens, resulting in a far broader distribution of wealth? It's an exciting idea which could apply to social networks and other online marketplaces, but it will require faster software and better systems of governance than we have seen so far. Could the promise of such companies offset the Ponzi scheme downside that occurs when they fail? I'm not sure. What about blockchains as currencies? Tens of billions of dollars of stablecoins are traded daily around the world and offer a corrective for devastating hyperinflation in low-income countries. It's a largely unregulated market that could become much larger and more useful with regulatory approval. With technological improvements, the efficiency of crypto as currency could improve dramatically. As Chris puts it, someday we may look back at 3% credit card fees as we now look back at the costs of long-distance phone calls a few decades ago, if you remember that. But what about the importance of central banks? Do we really want the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency threatened by new technology? There's a lot to digest here, which is why it's great to have a weekly podcast where we can continue to learn together and try to figure things out with the help of some of the world's great thinkers. If you have thoughts about this conversation, let's continue it on LinkedIn. Just search for Rufus Griscom and let's discuss in the comments under my post about this episode. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger. It was engineered by Danny Garcia, sound design by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.